Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us at another Deep Adaptation Q&A. And I'm really happy to have with us this month Deb Ozarko, who's written this book, Beyond Hope, Letting Go of a World in Collapse. And definitely one of the most forthright and comprehensive descriptions of how we've got into the tragic situation we're in now, the predicament we're in. Really doesn't pull punches in terms of why we're here, or the sort of like the depth of the challenge that it presents humanity and our psyche. So thank you very much, Deb Ozarko, for joining us for this hour's Q&A.
Thank you for your courage to have me, Jem.
I'm very happy to have you on, indeed.
Like you say, I don't pull punches.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you, for me, one of the nicest things about the book, which was a bit of a yee-haw moment for me, was how you said that originally you were setting out to write a book about the news story, about moving beyond the story of separation. And actually, as you look more into it, you realize that you would have been just sort of deluding yourself. I was wondering if we could start by you telling me a little bit about what you think the big lie is, and how we collude in that, even those of us who are seeing all the latest data on what's happening with climate change.
Yeah, well, for me, when I wrote about the that's right at the very beginning of the book, the big lie, the big lie, according to the way I see it, is that we are separate from the natural world, animals, and most importantly, ourselves. So we are, from the moment we're conceived, we're already being conditioned to believe that we as a species are superior to the natural world and animals. And as a result, we just believe that everything outside of us is a resource. And the reason for that, which I've discovered in my own personal evolutionary journey, is our self-separation. And when I say self-separation, without sounding too new agey or hokey, it's really the disconnect that happens when we're children from our souls, from our spirits, whatever you want to call that, from our internal guidance. And we're taught from the very get-go, from our parents to they're the authority figures, and we're taught to believe everything that they tell us. So all of the beliefs that were imposed on them by their parents and their parents before that, the generations of this cultural conditioning, are imposed on our tiny little fragile, very willing and open minds. And we believe that that's who we are. So when they tell us, like for me, one of the most important things that I'm sure you read about repeatedly in my book was veganism. That's something that's very, very important to me. I have a deep connection with animals and the natural world, and veganism as a lifestyle, not as just a dietary choice, has always been something that has helped me feel more connected to myself and to animals and the natural world. And in my own life, I had a huge battle with my father over that when I was a youngster. I was 12 years old when I knew that consuming like these big steaks that he would put on my plate was wrong. That all of that was wrong. And when I decided that I wanted to go vegetarian, that was not something that he accepted. So he was imposing his beliefs of you have to have meat to be a strong athlete. I was a swimmer, competitive swimmer at that time. And you have to have dairy and eggs. You have to have all of this stuff. And when I said, no, it doesn't feel right. And I know that I be a strong athlete, and I might at all. So that decision is to overcome and impose at all of the places in my life where belief systems that I didn't agree with were being imposed on me so I could be something that I knew that I was not. So for me, I was able to see that early on. I don't know why, I just was. And that led me on a path towards activism. I was a natural activist. I learned very early on how to fight for what I believed in.
An activist since 12 years old in pushing back against your dad.
Exactly. Pushing against the system. And in that case, it was my family system.
It's amazing. My partner went vegetarian when she was 12. And she remembers how that went down. She was living on a farm, I think, with her family. But so you've experienced this big lie in relation to parenting and some sense of oppression, of force. But what I'm really interested now is how we ourselves choose to collude with stories of separation. So whether that's human-centric ideas, whether it's stories that we justify to justify our abuse of nature or othering of people. I look back on my career and I know I've told myself a story that I have to just accept the system somehow if I want to change it. Otherwise, I'm just sort of living in my own dream world. And I'm wondering, any thoughts on the stories that the professional environmental movement sort of tells itself, which maintains the lie?
Yeah, I think that, without getting too specific, just using a very, very simple explanation of how we collude with it, I believe that fear is the biggest driver for all of the brutality in our lives. It's and in our world, we collude with the lie every single time we feel any kind of fear in our lives. So when we're connected with ourselves, there's no fear. There's no scarcity. There's no fear of money, no fear of relationships, no fear of speaking our truths, no fear of being different, no fear of collapse, no fear of death. So there's no fear. So self-connection.
What you mean when you say self-connection, connection with self, is that self with a big S and a bit more of a mystical
with a big
sense?
S. With a we'll call it spirit. I don't know, whatever language works for you. So if soul or spirit works better, or I don't know, you just Fred, Barney, you can call it whatever you want, but that internal guidance. So when you have that internal guidance, and there's nothing outside of us that we're afraid of anymore. There's nothing outside of us that can challenge what inside we know is true. There's nothing outside that can change that. So we become like internally so solid that when we express ourselves in the world, we're unshakable. And in that, there really is no fear.
Is that only really attainable through peak experiences of the transcendence of the limited self, or can it be experienced in some other way? And I mean, how did you, for example, get to really feel and tune into that greater self beyond the physical separate body that you're in?
For me, well, like I said, when I was younger, I was able to see that things weren't right. So I always had a connection, enough of a connection in myself to be able to see the lies that were out there. So that was there. Now, obviously I haven't mastered it because I haven't turned into a pillar of white light floating around in the ether of bliss. So I'm still here. I'm still working on mastery. But the catalyst for me was the very sudden, unexpected death of my mother in 2010. And there was that really shook my world. And I felt an overwhelming sense of lostness. That's the only way to describe it. And in that feeling of lostness, I was compelled to find what I didn't know was even lost. And so that was what sent me on the journey toward my own personal evolution and my own discovery of myself. And so it's been years and years of reading and workshops and retreats. And I mean, you name it, I've tried it.
I want to pick up on that that grief you just mentioned, because that was quite powerful for me in your book as well, where you
Yes.
talk about
Yeah.
grief being natural at this time, like a deep existential grief about what's happening in the world, and also about how we may have lived our lives in a deluded way.
Mm-hmm.
But also, what I loved about when you talk about grief, it's actually a means of experiencing self in a greater way, because you don't grieve
Yes,
unless you
absolutely.
are totally connected beyond yourself. But also, it was really interesting as you talked about grief grief for the planet, for example, isn't something you just do and tick off and then go on with the rest of your life. It's there with you all the time, and actually, in a way, it could be welcomed because it's part of this opening up of your heart and yourself to this greater sense of being. Is that
Mm-hmm.
any? Have I summarized that well?
Yeah, yes, yeah, you've articulated that very well. Grief for me has always been very painful and yet cathartic way to connect to myself. It's the thing about grief. It's tricky though. We have to be like, I think that it's very easy, and I speak from personal experience. It's very easy to get trapped in grief, and it then becomes an identity. And when it becomes an identity, then it's very, very difficult to allow the movement of the wisdom that's within grief to flow through, so that on the other side, to use the metaphor of the phoenix rising out of the ashes, to move into the flight of the phoenix. So what I'm seeing a lot of these days, and I can certainly understand it because, like I said, I've been immersed in this myself, is a lot of people are stuck in their grief, and they search for communities where they can grieve together, and then they start talking about, one person talks about their grief, another person talks about their grief, but nobody seems to be moving through it. They're all just commiserating with their grief. And so it just becomes a mire of grief rather than, the cathartic experience that it's meant to be, the evolutionary experience that it's meant to be.
How do we help each other to allow grief in each other, welcome it, but not get stuck in it? How do we help each other move through that, in your experience?
Again, I feel like that's really personal. We have to be self-aware enough to recognize when it is becoming an identity and when it's actually in flow. So that just, again, that comes with that self-connection. Without that self-connection, it's almost impossible to be able to move through it the way it's meant to be moved through. So I think that having community is a great thing. It's just being cautious about, being very careful about what is being expressed in the community. Is it just commiserating on grief, or is there the opportunity, the potential for movement so that everybody can evolve together? So I don't know if I've really answered your question. All I know is that it really comes down to self-awareness.
Okay, no, that's really helpful to hear, because I know that there's quite a lot of grief work, as you say, and it's good that that's growing, and there are grief cafes and death cafes and so on. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see that as a part of the process, and but yeah, not get stuck in it. So I'm interested then in this forum, the Deep Adaptation Forum, where we have people joining from around the world. To join the forum, we invite people to confirm that they see our predicament as the societal collapse as either likely, inevitable, or already unfolding. I was wondering, how do you now see the situation, in the sense of what is it you're actually grieving? And that then leads on to, if you're going to move through it, where do you end up after that? Because there's a lot of people who, when they listen to me talk about collapse, then say, but we need hope. and they have a material notion of what to hope for, rather than say a spiritual one or so on. So I was wondering, how do you see our predicament, our situation, and therefore what are you grieving and what are you moving towards in terms of something after grief?
Well, for me, the realization, I mean, I had a podcast. The first book that I wrote was all about the beautiful world that, to coin Charles Eisenstein's phrase, about the more beautiful world that I wanted to see. I was filled with hope. I was filled with passion for change and for creating this new story. And I had faith in the human spirit that we could do this despite where we were at. And it wasn't until I received an email from one of my blog readers who basically said, "Are you serious? It really is over." And when I, without getting into the content of that email, there was something about the way she wrote it that irritated me so much that I knew that this was not about her. This was about me. This was about something in me that I didn't want to recognize. And so I sat with that message for a few weeks. And in sitting with that message, I recognized a deep, deep well of grief that I was denying with my hope, that I was denying with my passion for changing what is unchangeable. I was basically distracting myself with this new story belief that I had, and dismissing what the deeper wisdom that I had inside. And so when I finally allowed that in, I moved through a lot of grief. Like I didn't know if I would ever come out of it. It was overwhelming. It was more than just the death of someone that I love. This is the death of life on this planet. It was so big. And then I started having premonitions. I had dreams that were haunting me, and it was confirming it. I've always been a very intuitive person, so I don't dismiss that. And then in 2015, I was living on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, and that was the year of change for me. That was when I lived through wildfire, and that was when I lived through bearing witness to the ocean in decay right before my eyes. I was watching starfish turn to mush. I would go out for kayaking paddles, and I would see death everywhere. So there's no denying it anymore. And then I just, as I was moving through the grief, one of the things that was really important for me to be able to express it was writing. And so I wrote an essay. And much like your report, this is something that I actually thought I was going to keep to myself. It was more kind of a journal. But there was something nagging at me inside that I needed to put this out there. And when I pushed the submit button on my blog, I was terrified, because I thought, this is not the Deb Ozarko that everybody knows anymore. This is not the false persona who is creating a new story anymore. This is somebody who's seeing a very different reality. And much to my surprise, like your report, this thing went viral. And I was shocked. I got emails from people all over the world who were feeling the same way, and who were just hungry for this truth. And so that actually helped me realize that I wasn't alone in this. And then I felt more confidence with writing the truth that I've known all along and that I needed to express. And each subsequent year, what I've noticed, I'm a real outdoors person. I keep seeing massive earth changes. I'm 55 years old now. So I'm in my sixth decade of life. And so I have a baseline that I can compare my outdoor experiences with. And they are radically different now than they were when I was younger. I've not only lived through wildfire and drought and dying ocean, I've also lived through flooding, tornadoes. This year, let's see, I'm now back in my hometown in Ottawa, because I just feel like things are accelerating so fast that I want to be closer to the people that I love the most. And it's been wonderful. I feel great being so close to everybody. But I see an exponential acceleration of, for me, ecosystem collapse. I know that social collapse and societal collapse is just around the corner, even though business as usual is as aggressive as it ever is. But for me, because I'm in the natural world, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing fewer dragonflies and fireflies and birds. And I'm living in a place that I lived in 11 years ago. So I actually have a huge baseline to compare it to here. There's been drought. It's either drought or deluge too. Things are very, very strange. So as far as ecosystems are concerned, that's what I pay the most attention to. And then you also asked about grief, where I grieve now. Well, for me, grief is a continual, there's continual momentum with grief. I don't find myself stuck in grief at all anymore. The primary source of my grief was the acceptance, the allowing of that deeper truth of collapse into my consciousness all those years ago. And in moving through the depths of that, I've come out into, like I said, the phoenix rising out of the ashes. I've come into a place of acceptance. And I really do. I accept the way it is right now. It doesn't mean that I've given up or that I've resigned. I'm also not fighting against anything. I'm just living my life. I feel more, and in living my life and choosing to live my life moment by moment in a more present way, I feel more connected. And I also recognize that when I go out into the world out there and I interact with other people, they see in me something in themselves that's missing. They see a connection, a deep connection to myself, and a profound, almost, I don't really know how to describe it, but it's a joy that I never had before. And it's just the only change for me, it's a perceptual shift. It's just, I went from denying it by wanting to create a new story to accepting, to grieving it, and then to acceptance. So it's a perceptual shift in acceptance that has given me this sacred feeling that I have now in my life.
I wanted to check in with you on that, because in the book you talk about having become really a spiritual activist, and that being the form of activism that makes sense to you now. And also you've just recently written a blog criticizing or offering a challenge to the activist impulse, as if it's sort of a craving for agency as a way of dealing with the shocking situation. And then you mentioned the child school strikes and Extinction Rebellion as venues for where that impulse could be. I was wondering if you could say something about the kind of activism that makes sense to you now, and if that can be integrated in any way in being public, in politics or in environmental activism like XR or something. So first, your understanding of spiritual activism, and then whether it can find expression in more traditional forms of engagement.
Yeah, spiritual activism, what I call that now evolutionary activism, because I recognize that spiritual activism seems to be, it seems more static, whereas evolutionary activism, to me, there's constant movement. And so for me, it's about personal evolution. It's the closer I get to myself, the more impact I have out there. And that's not, see, what's different for me with the activism that has led my life for the last 5 decades is that it was always about finding the enemy and fighting against the enemy. So whether the enemy is corporations or the government, or, I mean, the list is endless, right? So it's finding the enemy and fighting against the enemy. And so it was always, there was a lot of effort, there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of resistance. And when you look at that from a critical lens, it's all about separation. It's about an us and them mentality. There's no connection in that. How can we ever possibly expect to create change with an us and them mentality? It's not possible. So it's just perpetuating separation from the other side of the fence. So there are the corporations who are poisoning the oceans and streams and rivers, and the governments who are paying into it. And then there's the activists on the other side who are fighting all this stuff. So it's all, it's all feeding into the same separation. So spiritual activism, or evolutionary activism, as I now call it, is about stepping away from all of that. It's stepping away from all of that, because that's all external. And it's about going deep inside and looking within and go, what am I really fighting for? Am I really trying to save the earth? Or am I trying to save myself? And I recognized in myself that it wasn't, when I flipped it inward, that all of the effort out there was unexpressed grief. Because I can tell you this, that all of my activism was motivated by outrage, which was unexpressed grief. And outrage is a perfect fuel for activism. It's all about blaming somebody else and never, ever having the courage to look within. But when I turned that around, I was able to see my unexpressed grief, and I was able to just understand that it was more about saving myself than it was about saving anything else. And in saving sorry, go ahead.
No, you continue, sorry.
And in saving myself, a cliche phrase, in reconnecting to myself, we'll put it that way. Every choice that I make, my behavior has changed, the way I present myself in the world.
Would you say that
all of that inward, what you and I are doing right now?
Yeah, is this spiritual activism?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
This is it. You know why? Because you and I are just having an authentic conversation about what's meaningful for both of us, and we're sharing it. And that's all there is to it. And that, to me, has had a much, much greater impact than anything that I've ever done. Any protest, any revolution, any march, anything.
So it's looking inside to see all the fears that are between us, our awareness, and the truth, or the truths of our being, and then sharing from that place of vulnerability and curiosity. So dropping some of the old stories of what is it to be a credible human that's worthy of being listened to. Yeah, I resonate with that. And you've been on this path for a while, and actually, just before I pose this question, I just want to say to the people who are on the call, I see a few questions that have been posed for Deb in the Zoom group chat. Please, now I'm going to hand over soon to you. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please pop it in the chat. But Deb, before we do that, I wanted to ask you about, because you've been on this path for a while, a few years, if not longer, where you have personally rebelled against the mainstream notion of what it is to be an environmental activist, and accepted ecological breakdown and social collapse as happening now. How do you stay on that path? How do you stay nourished? Day to day. And this is quite a selfish question. Advice, please.
Those are the best kind, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, those are the best kind. How do I stay nourished? It's really, I have completely redirected my life. I have chosen to trust myself, trust my inner self, and trust the direction that it leads me. And so it led me away from the BC coast, and it took me over to the East Coast, and then it brought me here where I finally feel settled. And I'm living on I'm renting with my partner this 22-acre lovely little farmhouse, 22 acres of trails and woods all around us. And the farther removed I am from business as usual, the better. And so I make intentional choices to keep me nourished in that way. And of course, I, like everybody else, I do dip my toes into it now and then, but I minimize it as much as possible. But for me, the most important thing, like I mentioned earlier, is I am an outdoors person, and I have to be outside. And I go outside now with I'm holding everything. So I'm holding the collapse in my heart at the same time that I'm holding acceptance into my heart, that at the same time I'm holding joy in my heart. So there's the undercurrent of knowing about biosphere collapse, collapse of everything is always there. It's always there, but it does not the driver anymore. That always stays with me. And in that, I'm able to see through a different lens. So I can still go outside, and while I can look out at the trees right next to me, and I can see that the leaves are wilting because we've had a drought here. And at the same time, there's still a beauty there. So I hold both. It's about holding it all, because our hearts are infinite. We can hold it all. We can hold it all. And we just have to trust that we can hold it all. And just doing what nourishes me. So for me, I have a beautiful partner who I love spending time with, and we have 3 dogs who are just so much fun to be with. And they're just, they're all rescued from various situations, and they are just filled with love. And we love to go canoeing. So we'll just decide spontaneously that we're going to go out to a beautiful lake and we'll go paddling, and we'll paddle for the day. And there's not a place that we can go where there's not a human impact. So I'm constantly picking up garbage after people. I'm constantly picking up floating cans or debris and stuff like that. And I can grumble about that with my partner and allow that, just express that, allow that to move through, and then go right back into the beauty again. So it's about knowing that there's never a constant state. It's always in flow. The grief is in flow, the frustration's in flow, the joy is in flow, and it's all interwoven together.
I just had a bit of nature making some noise outside.
Sounds like my house.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm hearing it's the best answers are the simplest ones. It's to reconnect with love and beauty. Make sure that you make space for that in your life, and so that you're coming at the world with that sense of fullness and abundance of love and beauty, rather than saying, I hate you, world.
And you know what? And Jem, there are days when I do that too, and I'm okay with that. I'm totally okay with that, because that's part of the momentum, right? That's true. When we bottle that up, then it just grows, right? So it's when there's those days when it's like, God, this sucks. When is it ever going to be over? Why is this taking so long? Well, blah, blah. And then there are other days where it is what it is. This is the way it is on this planet. And I can still live in love, and I can still live in compassion. And I can't change the world, but I can change myself and express that in the world. And it doesn't matter if it makes a difference anymore. That's the thing, because I'm living authentically.
Thank you. So we're going to now go to questions from members of the Deep Adaptation Forum who are joining us from all over the place. First up, Kimberly Hare, who I know is in the UK because Kimberly was on a course with me recently. Over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you. Hi, Jem. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much, Deb. This has already been so incredible and useful and nourishing for me. So my husband, Ross, who's also watching, has a question. I sound like those people who say, my friend has a question. But, it's really about, and it's something we've been talking about a lot recently, and it's a non-practical question. It's really a kind of, I guess, a spiritual one. But given the oneness, given our sacred consciousness that we all share, I'd love your views on, does it really matter if we go extinct?
No.
Okay.
No. And, I can honestly say that it did matter to me 5 years ago. And there was still a part of me that felt just this overwhelming grief that life as we know it is all disappearing around us. And we're just one more species that's on the list. And now I recognize that every single one of us was born with an expiration date anyway. And so I think that to live backwards, to live with death in mind is actually a really, really beautiful thing. It prompts living more in the moment. It prompts living more authentically and connectedly and in a more sacred way. And now obviously we're now generalizing this out to our entire species. And I can honestly say that there was enormous grief to realize, and anger and outrage to recognize that we have done this not only to ourselves, but to everything beautiful and meaningful on this planet. And I think that it's really necessary to move through all of that, to be able to get to a place where our own extinction is really, it doesn't matter anymore. Because I have come to a place where I trust the natural intelligence of this planet. I mean, the story that we've been told about this planet is that it's billions of years old. And there's a resonance with me with that story. I believe that. And it's the other story that we've been told is that the planet has emerged through numerous extinctions prior to the one that we are now committing. And every single time, new life has emerged. And I do not doubt for a single moment that new life will emerge from our absence. I know that, and I trust, and this may be diluted on my part, and I'm okay saying this right now, but I trust that there's going to be more evolved life that emerges after we're gone, after the healing has happened. I trust the intelligence of the planet, and to me that's more important than the selfishness of me as a single species, because that's all I am. I am part of a single species. So that's my long answer to your great question.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks for the answer, Deb. It reminds me of when I first became aware some years ago of the possibility of near-term human extinction, particularly of what's been happening in the Arctic and the potential for runaway abrupt climate change. That was so deeply shocking, but then sent me into those very deep existential questions about, well, what is the meaning of life? And I don't mean my life or human life, I mean just life itself. And in a sense that's unanswerable, but it certainly means that you deprioritize all the nonsense of the concerns that come from this culture. And it also forces you to look at life without an anthropocentric assumption. And so, yeah, if we go extinct, I know that, I mean, I still think it's an if in the near term. I know quite a lot of people think it's certain in the near term, but if we go extinct, then that's not the end of consciousness or the process of life, either here or elsewhere.
Absolutely, yes.
And so, and also I think that we kind of need that. I mean, that it's shocking at first. There's a lot of grief, but also then it means that we can look at what's happening without any sort of hidden fears driving how we respond. Because I think otherwise, I think we can probably see some quite extreme and horrible proposals in the name of whatever it takes to prevent human extinction.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for people to really consider, well, what if we would go extinct, and then what would I believe in? You know, well, what's the most calm, beautiful, loving, gentle way of human extinction, for example?
And I feel for me, most importantly, is who do I choose to become in the face of human extinction, whether it happens or not? Who do I choose to be? And boy, that question it's such a deeply spiritual question, and it prompts me to be as connected as possible, not only to myself, but, well, actually, you know, by default, when I'm connected to myself, I am connected to all. So it's I really do believe that these are deeply spiritual times, and looking at it through that lens, I can see the beauty in it. I can see the beauty in the ugliness. And I feel like allowing that awareness into our consciousness, allowing the possibility of near-term extinction for our own species into our awareness can be a really, really powerful way to really connect to ourselves and to live the way we've always been meant to live. So
okay,
it's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this down to earth with a bit of a bump.
Okay.
While we may be all right with that, how do we talk to our kids? I think we're going to have a question about that from Yorgos, joining us from Greece. Hello, Yorgos.
Hello, Jem. Hello, all. Thank you, Deb, for your time.
Hello, Yorgos.
I hear what you said about your parents. For sure, all the kids have traumas from their childhood, from their parents. So my question is, what about us as parents? We have the same age, and I have two kids, 10 years old average. So do we have to leave our kids free on the adaptation, or we have to navigate them on this?
What feels right to you? Really, it ultimately comes down to you. I personally believe that there is nothing more connecting and powerful and beautiful and loving than speaking your truth.
Mm-hmm.
And in that you can all grieve together, and in that you can all grow together. So I honestly can't think of a more beautiful way to be with your children than to be honest with them.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Yorgos. And I know can be quite a lot of fear about when to be honest or how to be honest. But in my experience, yes, talking to children, particularly if I've just said, this is my perspective, this is now my reality, how I experience being alive, rather than trying to make claims about how things definitely are. I feel that also helps it become a bit more approachable. But,
absolutely. And I'm sure that I don't think kids are stupid. I think they understand what's going on too. And I feel like they don't have the same fear-based condition. They don't have the decades of fear-based conditioning that most of us on this call have. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're more accepting of this than we ever could be, and that our fears are really misplaced. But I think it would just be a beautifully connecting thing to do, to invite their perspective, to share yours, to share your vulnerability and your fears and your grief, and to invite theirs as well. Like, what a beautiful connecting experience.
I'm making a very short film just for YouTube about my conversations with children, and that should be out in a month or two, because it is such a difficult aspect of this topic. And Britt, there's another angle to this topic as well, isn't it? Having children. Please say where you're joining from.
Hi, I'm joining from New York City. Thank you so much for hosting this, Jem, and thank you, Deb, for sharing your wisdom and ideas with us here. It's really great. So this definitely piggybacks off the last question, but it has to do with how you decide to put children into this situation if you really want them, believing and seeing collapse and the possible unraveling that we're all here to talk about. And I've been convening meetings with a bunch of people in my generation, speaking from a millennial perspective, to talk about the link between reproductive choices and this kind of ecological crisis. And it's growing more fervent as a real dilemma in people's lives. Not necessarily just the guilt factor, but also just the fear and the questions of how ethical this is if you do see all the signs. And I'm just wondering, because of course this is personal, and of course it's about everyone's individual truths, how you think about this dilemma yourself, and how you would speak to people who are looking and grappling for some kind of guiding sense for their own decisions.
Wow, that's a tough question to answer, as I'm sure you understand. Yeah. I mean, I've never had any desire to have children. And for some reason, it's one of those things that I knew even 55 years ago that it wasn't the right thing to do on this planet. So I come from a very different perspective. I've never had a child. My children are four-legged and furry. And I guess in some ways I can relate to that, because I've adopted some young kittens recently, and I'm like, I know that they're not going to live out their full lives. I know that. And I also know that the life that I'm going to give them, and it doesn't matter if it's a kitten or a child, is going to be beautiful, and it's going to be magical, and it's going to be, I'm going to give all of myself to them for whatever time I have left. So I feel like if somebody came to me and spoke about that, I guess it would depend where they're coming from. You know, if they're coming from a place of cultural conditioning and their parents are expecting to become grandparents, then are you really making the right choice for yourself, you know, or are you doing it for somebody else? But if somebody really wants to have a child and they feel like that inner calling and they feel really compelled to, then I think the most important thing is for them is to be very conscious of our situation and understand that that child may only have, you know, 5, 6, 10 years, maybe 20 years tops. I don't know. Like, nobody knows, right? And how will you be with that child, and who will you be with that child? And are you prepared to be fully invested in that child's life without perpetuating this toxic civilization? I mean, I know somebody who just moved from Nova Scotia to Hawaii 2 years ago, actually, because that was her inner calling. And she has 2 young children, and she is aware of the collapse of everything. And she decided that she wants her kids to have the most connected, authentic lives possible. So she pulled them out of the education system, because the education system really just grooms us to do the work to perpetuate the civilization, right? We're all educated to become someone so that we can continue, we can make money and we can consume and blah, 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 blah. But she pulled them out of the educational system, and now they surf on the beaches. They, you know, they do what their inner calling every day presents to them. Like, if a parent is willing to allow a child to naturally express themselves like that and just live fully in every single moment, what a beautiful gift, right? And it doesn't matter then if you have only 5 or 10 years, you have lived a full life in those 5 or 10 years. But if somebody's having a child and then they're just going to push them through the educational system to just keep on going through the business as usual, that's a life wasted as far as I'm concerned. So I really do believe it's all about really conscious parenting.
Thank you, Deb. Some years ago, even before the latest horrific news about how fast climate change is happening, I decided I didn't want to have children because of climate change. But then I realized that I was sort of almost like having a quantity theory of the value of life, and thinking that because they might not live beyond a certain age, therefore their life would somehow be less valuable, less meaningful. But now, of course, I don't have that view, that assumption that, you know, it's just duration, quantity of life matters so much. I'm still afraid of the pain, because I see so many parents are able to deal with their own mortality but then they find it, and they're able to sense an aspect of self that is soul, that's eternal. But yes, that doesn't reduce that great fear of the vulnerability and of their children. And so for me now, it's more that it's almost like I don't want to invite that pain into my life. And I don't know, that might change, but at the moment, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I get that. I feel like if somebody, this is what I mean about conscious parenting, if somebody is going to make the choice in these times, it's really imperative to hold that awareness that this child may not experience a full lifetime. Well, most likely will not experience a full lifetime, and there's going to be a lot of pain. And are you willing to go through that pain to have that child? So it's, you know, it's a choice that I would never want to make. Like you, I just feel the same way.
Thank you. So before we go to Matthew, who's got a question, I just want to get your thoughts on this. So I just, since my paper came out, I've also had people from all walks of life, all spiritual traditions getting in touch and the Brahma Kumari got in touch, some of their top sisters. It's a women's-led organization. It was founded in the 30s, and the guy who founded it had a prophecy about the collapse of civilization. In fact, he said that there's a collapse of life every so many thousand years, and we're at that point. But they stopped talking about that because they were becoming seen as a doomsday cult. But it's quite a global religion now, very much focused on meditative practices and heart opening and so on, and belief in living from soul. But as I left their university for a meeting in London, they gave me this, which says, "Following your dream." And it says this: "Thinking about how I would like the world to be gives me the enthusiasm and courage to make things happen." Now, on first reading, this is the kind of thing that people tell me why I should shut up, because I have to stop being a defeatist. But then actually, it is a fascinating question, isn't it? Like, what is our dream? And when we talk about the way the world to be like, I mean, if there's full acceptance that life is magical and there's meaning and purpose no matter what happens in the flow of life, and that life will come again and so on. So what is the world that we wish to be in, and what is our dream? So what would be a spiritual rather than materialist response to this?
Oh, absolutely. The world that I am living right now, I am creating in my own life the world that I want to live in. I have created, I mean, we are all creators of our own lives, right? So I've created a beautiful life where I'm living in what I consider a very sacred environment. And we call this 22-acre parcel where we're at, we call it the sanctuary. And by living from the compassion that is inherent within me, it's interesting how there are more birds and butterflies and pollinating insects on this 22-acre parcel than there are on all our neighboring places, because we have neighbors coming over going, we don't have this, we don't have this. So I'm creating this world simply by living the way it feels the most meaningful for me. Compassion is the root of who I am. And compassion, I think compassion has this stigma of being like I said this the other day, a white fluffy bunny. But as far as I'm concerned, compassion is fierce. It's a very fiery expression of the soul. It's I don't know. I'm living the dream right now. And I feel like the only reason I'm living the dream is because I've allowed this awareness of collapse into my life. And I've chosen to live with this death sentence, with this, it's like, you have cancer and you've got 3 months to live. How are you going to choose to live that life?
Yeah.
When I was with my mother, and she was dying and I knew that she didn't have much time, how did I choose to be with her in that time? I wanted it to be as beautiful and sacred as possible. And so that's what I've created.
Thank you, Deb. You've described a way of being day to day that's beautiful and sacred for you. I do know that some people feel as activists their life is beautiful and sacred in quite a different way. And so I'm going to call in Matthew, who I work with at the forum, who's providing us tech support and who's been a lifelong activist and wants to take us back to that question about how one can be an activist in politics, in economics, maybe in Extinction Rebellion and so on, but with this consciousness that you described. Matthew, over to you.
Hi, Deb.
Hi, Matthew.
It's possible to listen to what you're saying and to understand that all the people who are really engaged in activism are doing so out of some inner trauma. And that's why it doesn't seem to work, or we always seem to be taking 1 step forward and 3 steps backwards. And I wondered if you met people doing good work that you didn't feel that was true for. People who are engaged in changing the world as best they can, but really from an attitude of joy. Because when I look at this, the idea of an activist as someone who's tortured in themselves, I don't resonate that in myself.
And that's a beautiful thing. Maybe you're not one of these people that, because I was certainly that. And the people that I surrounded myself were certainly that. And a lot of the people that I've seen were certainly that. And if you're not that, that's a beautiful thing. If you're coming from your, you know, at your activism from a place of joy and from a place of it feeds your soul, that to me is spiritual activism. That is whether, I think the key really is to not be attached to any sort of outcome. So if you're attached to an outcome of changing the world, you may be continually disappointed and you may feel continually frustrated. If you are satisfied with just expressing who you are out in the world and being satisfied with change or no change, that's a completely different story. Like I said, that to me is spiritual activism right there. It's like, you know, the Gandhi quote, be the change you wish to see in the world. He didn't say, be the change that you wish to see in the world and hold on to a specific outcome and make that happen. His was effortless. It was just being the change that you wish to see in the world. And if your activism is that, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, because for me, that's the real crux right now. So I've been involved in Extinction Rebellion a bit since before it started, and I'm helping them at the moment with a strategic rethink this summer before the International Rebellion kicks off properly again in the autumn. And yeah, I can see all kinds of people involved and involved for all kinds of reasons, some of whom really do want a simplistic, we can fix this, and it's us against them type mentality, but also people who are involved very much as spiritual activism, where it's about how can we live in truth and love and challenge the big lie and promote love and have a passion for everything they do, but not pretend that this is going to somehow fix the climate. And I think that you see people with different perspectives in that movement. And what I really like about it is that the people who are inviting are more of a sort of a conscious way of being, have influence. So they have a philosophy around no blame, no shame. They have a philosophy around deep inquiry into our own why are we doing this? What is our own trauma and pain? So although a lot of people don't get that, and they're just sort of they get that sense of the old activist energy, I think it's also potentially a place for dialogue around exactly the kind of conversation we've had today. How it all will work out, we'll see.
Yeah, it's really ultimately what it comes down to is whether it's activism or just life in general is who do you choose to be when you bring yourself into life? And, you know, I think when we start asking ourselves these deep internal questions, that's what really prompts the authentic self, capital S self, or the soul, to start emerging. And really, it's all about bringing that true aspect of who and what we are into the world. It doesn't really matter what the outcome is then, because we trust everything. It's just that there's a natural trust that evolves into just accepting the way it is. And, you know, I want to make it clear that when I say accepting the way it is, it's not about falling down in despair or being, you know, becoming, what's the word? Can't think of the word, but just, compliant to it. It's about just accepting that that's the way it is and speaking your truth. So just like, you know, what we are doing right now, it seems like I get the impression that there's an acceptance with you in the direction that we're going. And you're also speaking your truth. And in sharing that, there's a ripple effect. So, and that's not what I'm attached to anymore, is the ripple effect. That just happens on its own effortlessly. So that's the difference for me. With the activism before, there was effort attached to it and there was an outcome attached to it. Now there's no outcome and there's no effort and the impact is greater. That's the paradox.
Yeah, isn't it just? I've realized when when I released my paper in the same way you released your blog, and it was more or less to just speak my truth, and also therefore prevent myself from going back into delusion, and then gone viral. But then I've returned immediately to a story of responsibility to do as much as I can strategically and marshal resources and help everybody connect around this agenda. But I got to say, I've got to a point where I don't feel like talking about ecological or social collapse anymore.
I get that.
And so I know that I can't keep doing that. So it's perhaps being a convener around deep adaptation is that's going to have a limited shelf life for me. I'm wondering, I don't know what I'm going to do next. Something different next year.
Maybe you'll start paddling with your dogs.
Well, that's it. That's what I'm thinking, is that I still have this story of the ripple effect, like that it's important to think about scale and significance, and I still, that's still a powerful story for me that I haven't quite let go of yet. And
yeah, and I totally understand that. That's been an evolutionary letting go for me as well. And I find, you know, for me now, it's self-expression is really just on my blog and occasional interviews like this. And then I have roundtable conversations with my partner and my dearest friend, Louise Lebrun. And I just put those out there. And I know when something is meaningful for me, I know that it's meaningful for others, but that's not the reason why I put it out there. It's not for others. I know that in being meaningful for me, that is enough. And all I need to do is share that. And I think we're just so deeply conditioned, and I totally get this, Jem. We're so deeply conditioned to believe that we need to be selfless and we need to be in service and we need to put effort into it, even when it feels exhausting. And I feel like that's counterproductive. I feel like it's the ease that actually is more productive. And I can say this from personal experience because I've gone through the whole evolution. I've gone through the outrage and the anger and the activism and the fighting and then eventually letting it go and getting into the grief. I've moved through this whole evolution, and I've come to realize now that my impact is greater than it ever has been. And the beautiful thing is that A, it's effortless, and B, I don't have a specific outcome anymore. I'm just being myself and telling my truth. It's that simple. Like,
very, 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 I mean, I'm feeling a lightness, almost like a weight come off my shoulders listening to you. And it reminds me of when you say that, you know, just being you can be liberating for people around you.
Absolutely.
And, of course, the next question then is for me is how can I invite that way of being collaboratively within the forum? Because we have 5 people working for the forum now, and we have over 30 volunteers, and how to invite that kind of that sense of coming together through the Deep Adaptation Forum that doesn't feel stressful or an obligation or sacrifice, but is part of living a balanced, nourished life. So that's something, I'll send this video around to everyone I work with and all the volunteers. So that's very helpful. And it will therefore mean that I can say to everyone working with me, make sure I don't become an asshole. You know, but make sure that you all have fun. And tell me to go leave you alone and have fun too. All right. So Deb, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. I love this. I love doing these. Thanks, Deb, and see you next month.
Thank you, Jem. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So great to meet you all.
For the tech. Cheers.
Okay. Bye-bye.